All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I do just want to note some changes. I haven't uploaded a new syllabus, but I have changed these weekly modules. So instead of having an exam already this week, I thought it would be better if we moved that to next week. So the exam, you can take it either on Monday or on Tuesday through Gaucho Space, and that will open up on Monday. I'll be sending out a study guide, probably, let's see, today is Tuesday, so tomorrow, Wednesday. And basically what that will have are the different terms that you will need to know, different events you will need to know, essentially everything on the exam is covered on the study guide, but not necessarily everything on the study guide will be on the exam. Yeah, that's how it goes. So anyway, I'll talk more about that when I upload the lecture on Thursday. As I said, I think in the email, Tuesdays and Thursdays I'll be uploading the lectures. It just fits better, and you'll get a much better experience, I think. Okay, so we are basically, the exam will cover chapters 1 through 3. I'm kind of finishing up chapter 1, going into chapter 2, and then on Thursday I'll cover chapter 3 on sort of modern nationalism and that sort of thing. And then we jump ahead a little bit. So anyway, we'll get there. So I've enjoyed reading the packback responses from last week. You're very good. I enjoyed seeing some charts and quotations and various pictures that some of you had added to your response. So if you have any questions about that, just please feel free to contact me. But as I said, so far it looks very, very good. So today we are talking about sort of the origin of states before governments developed, or modern governments developed. So that brings us to a discussion of feudalism. And here we're primarily talking about the transition from European systems of feudalism to the nation state, essentially because that happened in Europe. However, not all feudal societies were located in Europe. There are feudal aspects of feudal society across the world. This isn't a perfect diagram of the feudal structure, and if you can tell from the readings, it was actually quite complicated who was really in power sometimes. So oftentimes you would have a king who owned the land, and they would give these fiefs to their lords and nobles that were below them. And in return for that, then basically they would offer to use their men, their soldiers, which were basically all men, and horses for the king if the king needed to. Then below that, sometimes you would have knights, and here's where the lords and knights it kind of depends on what country you're talking about, but generally the knights were soldiers. Sometimes they would be nobles themselves or have certain aspects of the nobility. And then at the very bottom you had peasants, and they worked the land, and usually for the fiefdom that the king had given to certain nobles. And the idea then was that the peasants would essentially, be protected by the king, or, if needed, they would enter military service. So that's essentially kind of what it looked like. So if you remember last time, we were talking about Rome and the fall of the Roman Empire, about how expansive it was and, how it just kind of fell apart over time. And what happens then with the fall of Rome is, and especially the fall of the Western Empire, you get this absence of an empire, of imperial power. So you have basically all these different nobles, lords, from previous Roman days. Excuse me. And in the course of the conflicts that happened, you would see these different hierarchies emerge, and they emerged into these what we would now call these feudal systems. Now, one thing I do want to point out, we tend to, in our imagination, and in many times in television and movies, we think of the medieval king or queen even, as being all powerful. Everyone just kind of bows to them, and so on. And, they own the country and this and that. But it actually it wasn't like that very often, and especially not in medieval times. Once we get to actually more recent times, as in a couple centuries ago, then, we see that kings were more powerful. But really, they had some amount of power. What they were good at is building coalitions of other lords and other nobles. In some ways, that was their major purpose in terms of feudalism. So this feudal society emerges because you don't have an empire there. It's, as we'll talk about, is sort of different on the eastern side, Eastern Europe and Russia and so on. So these feudal lords that were below the king, then they become heads of what are kind of like little mini countries. Oftentimes, this is kind of would have been shortly after the fall of Rome. You saw a lot of structures like this, where you have, the peasants working or villagers working, and this feudal state becomes what they call sub-infeudation. Basically, you have feudalism, but then it's also segmented to other nobles, and they segment it to, nobles below them, and so on and so forth. The important thing to keep in mind here is that kings and nobles by themselves never had enough men to fight wars and keep their own, their own vassals and lords under their sway. So they were always had to, to some extent, treat other lords well, ones that they wanted to have alliances with. Even later on, treating the peasantry well, because they would, over time, as military technology increased, the peasants became more useful as they developed things like the longbow, the bow and arrow, which peasants could use, as opposed to the swords and shields and things that take a lot more training, and so on and so forth. So anyway, you start to see peasants playing an interesting role, and that role continues. Now, the other major power in the Middle Ages in Europe becomes the Catholic Church. So towards the end of the Roman Empire, Rome had essentially converted to Christianity. So while the Roman Empire collapses, the Christian Church does not, and the Catholic Church then becomes one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, because it's the one organization after the fall of Rome that has really stayed together, and because of it represented the common belief system of the post-Romans, that's generally kind of naturally where power tended to gravitate. And over time, you started to see, these tighter links between clerics and aristocrats. And they would try to curry favor with Rome, which Rome at this time means the Catholic Church, not necessarily Rome of the ancient Roman Empire. So when I say Rome, from now on, in this context, I'll usually be referring to referring to the church, which was located there. So as I said, land, excuse me. Land systems become very interesting in Europe at this time, and they become very confusing. Before then it was fairly clear. You had the system set up by the Romans. After the Roman Empire collapses, you're sort of rebuilding societies essentially. So oftentimes peasants didn't really pay much attention to what was happening in terms of like high politics. They didn't really have any connection to the kings or much of the nobility, just kind of the local lord or noble. So they, for the most part, lived very separate lives from those who were in power and really didn't even know who was in power. However, as you can see in this picture, sometimes they were recruited for military purposes. And here again, it wasn't until military technology changed from swords to these long spears, for example, that peasants could use more easily. Over time, you also started to see peasants being forced off their land and moving into towns, and you started to see this interesting emergence of these towns and these sort of new political systems that were emerging here in these larger concentrations of where people were located. So it's interesting, even though the Catholic Church was extremely powerful during this time, the most powerful single organization in Europe by far, the Catholic Church still didn't have a whole lot of control over individual beliefs. And that's one reason why Protestantism was so successful when it began, is because the Catholic Church didn't necessarily have a lot of people in Northern Europe that were deeply connected to those communities. And so the things that Martin Luther rebelled against against the Catholic Church for, they caught on in ways that you probably wouldn't have seen if they would have been done in Italy or Spain, places where Catholicism had a very, very, very strong hold on people's belief systems. So in the 1500s, the Council of Trent, they sent these priests out on this mission to do sort of an early sociological survey, seeing basically trying to understand the population, and they were really trying to gauge the threat of Protestantism. They were trying to see, okay, how many Protestants are out there, and so on. And then what they found, though, during the course of this survey was that they found that most people practice some sort of, amalgamation of Catholicism and pagan superstition, which today in, contemporary United States, we see this in the Christmas traditions, the Yule log or the Christmas tree. Old Saint Nick, Santa Claus, all of these things, holly, mistletoe, a lot of the things that are associated with Christmas in the United States, or especially kind of like Victorian England, and so on. Almost all of that stuff is, pagan practices from the dark, from the Dark Ages. Let me take a drink of water here. Hope I'm not blowing anyone's ears with my coughs. So anyway, the church then took it upon themselves to try to convert people and try to end the pagan beliefs. Another thing that we also have to keep in mind about Europe at this time, keep in mind this about everywhere, but especially Europe, there were a lot of different languages that were spoken. And I think it was up until even the early 1900s where something like only 1/4 or 1/3 of people living in what's now France actually spoke French. There were different, kind of regional languages and dialects and so on. And so that meant that really for most people, they didn't have much communication with people outside their village. So they might go down the road just a few miles, come to a new village, and not be able to communicate with anyone because the language was so different. You see this today in places like Papua New Guinea, where different settlements and villages are located in valleys that are sort of separated, where they're separated from each other, and have developed different language and cultural belief systems and so on. So anyway, that again made centralization hard to happen. So that's why you see, almost 1,000 years go by before you start to see European societies, governments start to centralize into what we now think of as those as modern nation states. A few other things that I think are kind of interesting about the fall of Rome and are sort of kind of relevant for today. I noticed a lot of people kind of had raised questions about, okay, what does the fall of Rome mean for us in America today, and that comparison is often made. And there are a lot of historical differences, but there are also a number of similarities. One of the things that is kind of interesting is technology. For example, we tend to have in our minds this idea of technology as this sort of linear path upward. We're always just constantly making advancements. So the Romans learned how to make cement, and they built a lot of buildings and were able to make a lot of structures using cement. But then that knowledge was lost for almost 1,000 years. And so you had, for centuries, you had people living in these Roman cement structures, but they had no idea how they were made. Similarly, in in England at this time, people were, the Romans learned you could, shave off or cut off the wool from a sheep, and you could put that in your mattress or your pillow, and it'd be much more comfortable than straw, which is what people had been using. And so that practice, stuck around for a while until the Roman Empire collapsed. And then for, in a few hundred years, you get people in Britain stuffing their pillows and everything with straw again. When the Romans had realized much earlier that actually wool is much more comfortable. And so again, it was not till a few centuries later that, some, innovative British person realized that, hey, that wool would actually work better than this straw. So anyway, just kind of interesting just to think about, because we tend to think of as technology as just linear, always going upward. And the reality is it kind of, it's like a roller coaster that winds and weaves and so on and so forth. Anyway, there were other things that we saw quite a bit during this time that we really don't see much of today, and that is the city-state, where basically you would have cities that were essentially countries. They had more people often than most countries did. They had more development in terms of legal systems, planning, building, all of these sorts of things you start to see come together in the cities. So, and at this time, I think it's also important to recognize that the cities that were the biggest were the cities in Italy and in Belgium and in the Netherlands, Amsterdam. These cities were larger than London or Paris because they were trading hubs. They were, the gateway to the Middle East and Asia. And so they were larger because you just had more people there. You had more opportunities for work, that sort of thing. You didn't see this happen really with England or France as much. London and say, Manchester or whatever English town, they didn't have quite the same levels of independence because they were kind of taken over in a way that we didn't see in other places. Essentially, what happened was that the kings of England were able to develop that monopoly on the use of force for a variety of historical reasons. Not going to go through right now, but you didn't see that happen in Italy or in places that had strong city-states. So English towns were comparably weak, and so one of the reasons that the people in Florence were allowed to do a lot of the banking for the English was because power was so unstable in England during these times. Now we see this pattern where there was a single elite that dominated the country in which the town was located, and the merchants were under the noble or the king or whoever. You noticed that the king or bishop's domination was relatively poor. They didn't have the same power. And I guess I have that written twice there, but yeah, that's basically the pattern that you would notice was when a single elite dominated a territory in which you saw a town, then the forces, politics within the town weren't I should say, the forces of authority within the town were not as powerful. Some of the earliest examples of successful city-states were in ancient Greece. That was essentially the model. There was no Greek country. You just had a number of these Greek city-states. And so there was Athens being, one of the most important, and so on. Today, as I said, we don't see city-states as often. A couple examples: Singapore, Hong Kong. I would say Hong Kong was kind of like a city-state until just a few months ago, when it technically has rejoined the nation of China, and we'll just kind of have to see kind of what happens to Hong Kong if it's allowed to have some of its city-state aspects, or if it becomes just like another city in China. And we'll just kind of have to see what happens there. And Singapore is often noted as the world's most successful city-state, and seen as kind of a model for other countries or other cities that would love to attain that status. There are a number of things about Singapore. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's known for its safety, all of these things, but it also has very authoritarian laws. They do not look kindly on things like crime of any sort, vandalism, drug use, things like that. So usually when we talk about city-states, we're primarily referring to city-states in history. And so after you have the Greek city-states, the next kind of group of powerful city-states that emerges is in Italy during the Renaissance in roughly around 1500. So you can see here are, Florence, as I said, Florence and Venice. These two cities were larger than London and Paris for quite a long time, actually. So there were some differences between, say, those nobles in a city as opposed to those nobles in the sort of countryside feudal system. The ruling urban aristocrats basically needed to work in blocks with each other. Some of them may have been in control of the wool trade, some of the metal trade. They were often involved with the economy, and so they would, if they didn't agree with other nobles or the king or something like this, they would have to kind of band together. And you started to see the merchant class rise, even in England and in France as time goes by, especially as you get into the 1500s, as the Italian city-states become more powerful as locations of finance and centers of finance. So as I said, Florence, that's what Florence looks like today. So Florence is an interesting place if you're interested in politics. Probably the first place that ballot stuffing first happened. So ballot stuffing is, where you write the person you want to win their name a bunch of times and stuff it in the ballot box. And so we think that practice basically originated in Florence. So as I said, the Florentines become essentially the bankers of the world for quite some time. And this was also, they were located not too far from the Catholic Church. And so that's one reason they become so powerful is because they become linked to the Catholic Church. However, there are a number of different Italian city-states and so on that are competing, a number of families like the Medici that are competing with each other within Florence and so on. So this is actually a very, very bloody time in history. So the Florentines were not necessarily, the just finance whizzes or something like this, but England was so embroiled in conflict, and they were and in the creation of a modern nation state, whether they knew it or not. That's, they basically just said, all right, here, Italians, people in Florence, do our, do our accounting for us, is more or less what happened there. So the popes then relied on this Medici family in Florence for as political allies, more than as financiers. The Catholic Church was already fairly wealthy. The Medici were wealthy as well. I believe there's now a show about them. But the Medici were this very historically famous family, one that was kind of like an early mafia family kind of thing. This is also the time period where you see here this guy Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is one of the more misunderstood people from this time period. If you're familiar with him, you might have had to read The Prince in maybe like some history course or something like this. He's best known for this book called The Prince. It's more or less, it's based on one of the Borgias, which was this family that gave, I think, a couple of popes came from the Borgias. And so he's looking at one of the Borgias and looking at how this guy wields power and sort of getting some ideas from that, and also looking at ways this guy could improve. I think it was Cesar Borgia. And so he writes this book called The Prince, and it's primarily written for nobles how to hold power, essentially. And he kind of advocates that, you need to do everything from compromising to deceit or violence. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that this was written during an extraordinarily violent time in Italian history and in world history. As I said, there were these different groups, these different city-states and so on that were competing with each other and fighting, conflicting with each other over power. Recently, a new biography of Machiavelli came out. He also wrote this book or series of essays called The Discourses. And those are actually in some ways more useful because they talk about a lot of different aspects of political science. I mean, in some ways, this is these books are the first works of political science. Now, interestingly, Machiavelli, when we talk about Machiavellianism today, we're usually talking about manipulation, deceitfulness, that sort of thing. And so people have done research looking at people who score high on these Machiavellian traits. And what they have found, at least in today's modern world, is that actually people who score high on Machiavellianism don't do so well in organizations. They're less likely to be promoted if they're deceitful and don't compromise and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. But definitely we also see examples where people practice Machiavellianism, and that's how they essentially take power. Now, city-states, they didn't last. Essentially, even the powerful Italian ones, at the end of the day, you're sort of confined to that city. And if some other city can just get a couple more cities with them and form an alliance, then you're in trouble. And that's essentially what happens, is that they just cannot mobilize the forces that they will need to remain an autonomous city-state. And when they did make alliances, they didn't really last for a long time. So they might make an alliance with a certain king, but then that king is overthrown and the new king has no interest whatsoever in this previous alliance. And so that would fall apart. So that was essentially, you see the end of the city-states and the development. You start to see the development of sort of modern kingdoms. Now, I talked about this before. I just want to kind of go through it quickly again. During this time period, you're also seeing in China a number of things happen. Now, the key point that I'm making here somewhere. So a few slides down. These slides were in the last lecture, I believe. So remember, Confucianism becomes an important way in which it becomes an important philosophy for the governance of China. And essentially, the wealthy were educated in Confucianism. And the other thing that we saw is the Tang Dynasty. Remember the Tang Dynasty, which is, where is it now? I lost it. It's the Tang Dynasty down here, yeah. The Tang Dynasty was able to centralize military and government into a Roman-like system almost. Now you might wonder, okay, why didn't the Chinese empires, they have a history of falling, and a new one comes up and then it collapses. Why didn't the collapse of Chinese empires ever end in feudalism? That, like we saw with the end of the Roman Empire. And one of the main reasons is because China's educational system, its bureaucratic way of doing things did not collapse. They stayed intact regardless of who the emperor was, mostly intact, I should say. But so you may have the fall of an empire, but you would still have the same bureaucratic forces at work. And so this basically, meant that you didn't see feudalism emerge like you did in Europe. And as I said before, the officials were assessed every few years and so on. Now, getting back into the sociology of things. So there's a sociologist named John Mayer. He and his students were kind of made this model looking at modern states, and he made the argument that the reason that they formed was to maintain the ability to tax their subjects. And importantly, subjects were very far from rulers, kind of as I talked about earlier. So he says that the reason why we see a lot of these feudal states emerge in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire is something he calls institutional isomorphism. And now this has been used to study a whole range of different institutions, but basically they're looking at, okay, what are the ways in which you get the same sort of feudal institution, this feudal pyramid copied over and over again. And so they look at that, looking at the sort of coercive ways in which that happened, the ways in which norms change, and the ways in which just places copy other places that seem to be doing things rather well, or rather somewhat effectively, or at least more effectively. So this has been a useful way in which to understand states. However, there are some problems in that it also fails to explain why some places didn't become feudal. It doesn't necessarily have as much to say about that. Now, if you remember, we talked about Max Weber and his ideas about Protestantism. Another sociologist with the last name Gorski looked at Calvinism and this new sort of a very, very disciplined, very rigid social system that Calvinism was kind of bringing into European government. And he kind of noticed that this sort of discipline that the Calvinists were sort of demanding of their subjects was also spilling over into how places were being governed. So that sort of discipline that you saw in Calvinism, we see then in the way in which places were governed. An important analyst of government nation states is a guy named Perry Anderson. He takes a Marxist perspective. So the Marxist perspective, basically throughout all time, the main idea that Marx kind of animates Marx's thinking is that throughout time it's been a kind of a struggle between the ruling class on the one hand and the working class on the other, whether they're the working class is peasants or slaves or actual wage workers, whatever it might be. So Perry Anderson kind of adopts this approach, and not necessarily, literally, but, for the most part, takes a Marxist approach and is curious where the bourgeois comes from, the bourgeoisie. The early merchant class, the early commercial, early capitalist class, essentially. And Perry Anderson is curious how that came about and how they became so powerful within Europe. Well, one of the things that led to the power, a greater power of bourgeoisie, was the Black Death, which was the bubonic plague. We're now familiar with things like plagues and how they can affect political systems and so on and so forth. So the Black Death, by some estimates, led to 1/3 of the European population dying. That's a huge proportion of the population that dies. And after it happens, it really just messes society up so much that there becomes this need for greater centralization, so that they know how much food is available, know where people are, how many people are left, all of these different things. So you see more centralization. You also start to see government become this vehicle for the aristocrats who have survived the Black Death. They become more powerful, and they use government then as a place in which to have alliances, build up their support, and so on. A lot of the peasants were hit the hardest by the plague, and they had been powerless beforehand. Now they were even more powerless, and a lot of them were really then become dependent upon the aristocrats. And so Perry Anderson argues that the bourgeois, by being merchants and helping to becoming the aristocrats, essentially, that they helped entrench the feudal system. That's his argument. It was challenged by a guy named Charles Tilley. Tilley said, well, that all sounds fairly good, but then why do you see the bourgeois, this kind of new merchant class, why do you see them at the front of the revolutions in Britain in the 1600s or in the French Revolution of 1789? So Anderson's model doesn't really explain that. It doesn't explain why the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy come together, why they come together and at certain times revolt. He also can't really specify who strengthened this absolutist state. So Perry Anderson is interested in how the government becomes so centralized, how power becomes so concentrated, and so on. But his model, other than sticking to this Marxist idea, doesn't really focus on the specific actors, such as the specific merchants or aristocrats. Was it ones who had more connections to the sea, meaning to trade? Was it ones who had more land? That sort of thing. Anderson just doesn't really touch upon that as much. Charles Tilley does. Charles Tilley builds off of a lot of Max Weber's work. So Tilley says that if you want to understand the development of modern governments, you have to understand that ancient or medieval rulers are more important than early capitalists. And you want to look at capital-rich countries. And through this huge history he generally found that states that combined capital with coercion came out on top during this period. And we get the development of what's called the fiscal military model. It's path dependent, meaning that that these alliances between finance and military power that really were forged early on, they kind of set the path of those certain countries that engaged in that. So the initial deals that rulers struck with, I should say, with capital or coercion often shaped the organization of each state. So later on, another analyst looked at these two dimensions of states. One being absolutism. This would be the King of France, the later kings of France, where all power was located in Louis XIV's power. I mean, within his kingship and so on. And then secondly, constitutional regimes, and those have become more and more the case. You've seen, we don't see monarchies and absolutist monarchies very often anymore. We primarily see constitutional regimes. Absolutism now we tend to think of as fascist or totalitarian societies rather than monarchies. So Weber had famously made this argument that capitalism was linked to the Protestant ethics, or ethics that come out of Protestantism. Tilly kind of avoids that and again focuses more on rulers, military technology, and the cities that start to join states for greater protection. So in a lot of ways, Tilly's argument comes down to the state becoming, what does he say? I forget what he say. The state was built for war and war is made for the state, or something like that. He had some comment on that. Anyways, making the case that most modern states were developed for the purposes of war, of fighting another state. And these are often cities that decide then to band together. Pokey, another researcher, looks at some of these feudal areas, looks at feudal states and towns, and sees how they start to weaken, and start to change. So feudal states and towns, they start to weaken from within. Essentially, they don't innovate in terms of how to make money, in terms of their accounting. A new king comes along and they just use the same practice that was used before, even though the population has changed. Maybe the climate conditions have changed a bit, and so in terms of agriculture, and so it becomes very inefficient. Increasingly, feudalism becomes a very inefficient way of managing society. So what you see then is bureaucracy start to develop, and it becomes more organized, and it then becomes more easier to tax subjects. And this is what Poge calls a hinge of history, where certain actors and states, they take a path, and it becomes this turning point, this hinge, that turns the page of history, the door of history, whatever. And so this happens in a number of different societies. One of the first places that you start to see this is in early medieval England. In 1381, you get one of the first tax revolts, where the peasants were angry about how much they were being taxed. They knew that the system was corrupt, and so on and so forth. And so they revolted. Eventually, their revolt was put down, but the outcome of that ends up being a less corrupt system. You have lowered costs for certain goods, and the peasants, the nobles essentially don't want their peasants to rise up again, and change the system accordingly. Another early kind of revolt that happens. So you see a lot of revolts actually throughout the middle, in the later part especially of the feudal period, as we're starting to see feudalism break down. So in Spain you get what are called the Comuneros revolts of the 1520s. So these were again revolts of various various kind of like forces, urban factions within some of the city states. This one was crushed, but what it ended up leading to was, again, more centralization, and it was crushed pretty effectively, so that you didn't see any more of these revolts happen in Castile, and you can read about that in more detail in the textbook. So a lot of these theories then are using what's called rational choice theory. Looking at levels of taxation to determine whether or not to wage war. So the rational choice theory, when historians and sociologists and others started to look at the past, they were trying to determine, okay, could we kind of predict war based upon whether or not the taxation went up? They did notice in some places, such as rebellions were less likely in absolutist France when the taxes were used for war. If the taxes were used for anything else, which were usually, making life nicer for the nobles, then you were more likely to see a rebellion. If you saw cooperation between kings and subjects, that would often increase tribalism. So the peasants and so on, the subjects, they felt a greater loyalty to the kings than was the case in the earlier feudal periods. Now, rational choice theory fails to explain turning points. These hinges of history, for example, just doesn't do as good at recognizing that. I think to have a better idea of that, we need to turn to Michael Mann, who I believe is emeritus at UCLA, and his theories of power. He looks at networks, different networks of power. So he notices that power was very decentralized during the feudal times in Europe, but the church was very, very centralized. And so there were many places that couldn't mobilize to fight off forces, and that's what then they would essentially they would gain assistance by others, essentially because of who they were closer networked with. If they had strong ties to another strong state, or to a strong city state, or to the church, or something like this, then they were more likely to be able to fight off challenges. One of the problems with Mann's analysis is that it tended to look at the state and the church as being these unitary entities. So while he acknowledges the importance of recognizing the networked aspects of it, he still kind of talks about them as if they're these kind of large monolithic institutions. So to look at some kind of specific examples. So Spain develops as after the invasion by the Muslims of the, I believe, 800s or so. Those areas get retaken by the feudal forces in Europe. The Habsburgs they're located in what's now Austria and Hungary, but they control Spain, and they do it by letting the local aristocrats basically, have a lot of power. And Spain, the other source of power is the Catholic Church. So you have the local aristocracy kind of, who control things, but are sort of subject to some control by the Habsburgs and the Catholic Church. So because of this, because the aristocrats didn't have sort of total control, they had kind of a weaker state. And because of that, they had more and more problems, fiscal problems, financial problems. Some of these aristocrats, since they knew that, the Habsburg were, far away that they could kind of hide away some of their wealth from the Habsburgs. So they could do that and then still depend on the Habsburgs for more money or for soldiers or for technology, these sorts of things. And the Habsburgs were not very good at monitoring what was going on in Spain. And so you notice then that the Habsburg Empire slowly declines, that they don't add any more new territory after 1500, and they basically start to fall apart after that time. France, it's a bit different. So France, initially, the kings had weak control until the 1400s. Then you get what we call vertical absolutism. So initially, the Habsburgs, again, they were very powerful. They ceded Spanish rulers, local power, revenue, and so on. In France, however, the king was much more in control, and you start to see this vertical absolutism happen where they start to gather the most powerful elites around them. And pretty soon all the other elites are trying to, they see that the king is where the power is, so they try to, kiss the king's butt and that sort of thing. So by the 1600s, about half of the revenue is coming from these new nobles. So the way in which the king does this is through the creation of these, what are called these venal offices. Excuse me. So it works out well for a while because you don't have the nobles, rebelling against you. They're providing taxes and so on, but you need to create a new office every time a new noble comes along to, make them happy and go along with the king. So they called them these venal offices. And these venal offices are basically these new offices that are created through corruption and bribery. And so the crown also created what they called these intendants, which were non-venal, meaning that they were legitimate and, not corrupt and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, they required revenue. And so after a while, the crown just had trouble paying all these different offices that it had created. So you get the Frondes, which was the last... Oh, I've got a cat here. This obviously wasn't the cat who had to be put down last week, but this is my other teaching assistant who doesn't do much, but anyway, well, every so often she'll make an appearance, and she just likes to be held for a little bit, and so I just have to kind of hold her while she meows a lot during the lecture. So anyway, the Frondes ends up being the last major armed challenge until the 1789, at least. Okay, time for you to go. All right. Okay, so that as I said, the Frondes is the last major armed challenge to the crown until the big revolution of 1789. So basically, the history of France, they learned the elites, the nobles, learned that they needed to be they needed to appeal to the state. That the state was becoming a powerful thing. And then you get the French Revolution of 1789, inspired in many ways by the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinking. The philosophers like John Locke and Rousseau and others, they had watched what had happened in the American Revolution and were inspired by that. But this is a much more radical revolution because the American Revolution was just essentially kicking out the British and sending them back to the island of England. It was not an overthrow of the British monarchy and a takeover of the state. That's what the French Revolution was, and they were trying to completely make a new society. So, as I said, they were looking at philosophers like Rousseau, John Locke, the Enlightenment, reason, Voltaire, a lot of these names that are associated with the 1700s and so on. And then there are others that people don't read as much, but I would strongly recommend that you do if you're interested in politics and so on. People like Joseph de Maistre, which I don't think I'm pronouncing right, de Maistre, something like that. He's an interesting character. He was a noble of a small principality of Savoy, and France kind of got sick of him because he was satirical, and I don't know, they sent him to St. Petersburg to be the ambassador there, and he writes up these things attacking democracy, and he was very traumatized by the bloodshed of the French Revolution, and basically in his mind then monarchy or aristocracy is better than democracy, and so a lot of people see him as being like a precursor to fascist philosophy. I think that's a bit harsh. I think he's definitely no fan of democracy, and he's writing at a time when it seemed that democracy was leading to a lot of bloodshed. But as I said, I think he's worth checking out if you're interested in some of this stuff. Well, then you have, I'm just going through some of the countries your book discusses. You have the Netherlands, also known as Holland, who also, the people there who are known as the Dutch and sometimes the Flemish, so a lot of different names there. So interestingly, they were never a feudal state. They were able to remain a series of towns that were decentralized, they would come together to refute the Catholic Habsburgs and the Spanish, which took over for a little while, and so they never formed their own state, at least not for quite some time. The other reason that they never ever developed a feudal system is that they became sailors very early on and started becoming merchants, and so you start to see the development of the merchant capitalist class that Max Weber talked about, really starting to develop here in the Netherlands. In terms of Great Britain, I talked about them a little bit, so I'm not going to say too much, but basically they were able to create that monopoly on force that Max Weber discusses as being sort of a key component, or the key component of the modern nation state. And so Henry VIII was able to do that, expropriated church property, broke away from the Catholic Church, and became kind of the first sort of modern, relatively modern nation state. But at the same time, they were unable to create a bureaucracy. By the 1700s, you have these two political parties that have emerged, the Whigs and I believe it was the Tories then. And you have this conflict, the English Civil War between the parliamentary forces, which were sort of coming together at that time, and the Stuart dynasty. And the parliamentary forces were led by Oliver Cromwell, and he takes over, beats the monarchy, and becomes essentially one of the world's first modern military dictators. Then he was killed, and which finally kind of amusing. It was 3 years after he was killed, they were still mad at him or something, so they dug him up, what was left of him, his remains, and they drawn and quartered him again, and they chopped his head off again, and light his bones on fire. I don't know, but anyway, they weren't done punishing him yet, I guess. So interesting story. And so anyway, by the time you get the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is a very long, convoluted story about British monarchy and so on, you get the real establishment of Parliament, of the modern Parliament, and pretty soon over time the members of Parliament start to represent the elite, and they become more powerful than the crown. Now Russia takes an interesting and different direction. It's certainly a feudal system, and it actually remains a feudal system until the late 1800s, early 1900s, for a few different reasons. Excuse me. So, for one thing, the Orthodox Church in well, I should say, first of all, the Eastern Roman Empire doesn't quite collapse in the same way as the empire in Rome. It's kind of more this gradual thing, and then the church that develops in Greece and in Russia become the Orthodox Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, slightly different than Catholicism, but they didn't have a Reformation. There was no Protestant uprising, so you didn't see the same alliance building. There was trouble controlling the peasants after the Black Death, kind of like what happened in the parts of Western Europe. So nobles joined states to fight off attacks from other Central Asian armies. So remember, you have like the Huns and the Genghis Khan and the Mongolians coming in, various other attacks coming from places in Central Asia. State formation is very different from that fiscal military model that we talked about. State formation in Russia actually kind of fits Anderson's model more than say France or England. You have this Grand Duchy of Muscovy, becomes Russia essentially. Merchants, the merchant class, didn't really play any role. They weren't there. They just weren't very much of a force in Russia. The cleric's position was very secure. The church was very powerful, and the peasants were part of this system of serfdom, which we'll kind of talk about more as we talk about the development of nations. But anyway, it goes from being sort of these peasants to these individuals to this broader category of serfs that we shall discuss. They shared an interest, though, in expanding the power of the state. And Catherine the Great becomes one of the, they call her the Great because she is one of the people to do this. She appropriates a lot of the church, kind of like Henry VIII did. Did I say Catherine the Eighth? I missed Catherine the Second. I said Catherine the Great. I tied that up in knots. Okay, Catherine the Great. Henry VIII, okay, there, now I know where I got screwed up. Okay, so they both kind of expropriated the wealth of the church, and, that made the state more powerful over time. And it meant that over time, the state owned 40% of the serfs, the peasants, where you did not see that happen in the same way in other European countries. Different nobles gained the right to move serfs or sell them, kind of like in slavery in the Americas, but a lot different, actually. In the 1700s, you start to see the state begin to centralize, and the serfs become the main sort of workforce of the state, which remains until the Communist Revolution primarily an agricultural state. Moving just a little bit away to Poland and Hungary, there you saw aristocracies that were organized at the regional level. Interestingly, you had kings here were not hereditary, meaning that they didn't get their king from the son of the last king. Rather, they were elected by the Diet, which was basically the parliament, the legislative body. And so Poland, Hungary, again, these places were just not in the best geographic location when it came to invasions. So you would have various forces coming from Russia and Central Asia that would be invading Poland and Hungary, and in the 1700s, Poland was actually partitioned amongst Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and Hungary too was part of that. Now, feudalism isn't limited to Europe. As I said, we didn't see a feudal system emerge in China, but we saw a feudalistic system emerge in Japan that was actually quite similar to what we would have seen in parts of Europe. So you had the emperor and the shoguns who competed for power, and their efforts were limited by a group called the daimyo, who are these hereditary lords who owned pieces of land across Japan. And this is kind of what it looked like. The emperor was at the top of society, but kind of like Queen Elizabeth today in England, was more of a figurehead rather than a ruler. The shogun was really the actual ruler and aligned with the various daimyo, the wealthy landowners, and kind of along with them, some of the daimyo were samurai, but immediately beneath the shogun and the daimyo were the samurai warriors, and these were some of Japan's primary fighters and rulers and so on. The largest class, as in many places, were the peasants and artisans, and kind of in contrast to what you saw in, say, Italy and France, the merchants were actually on the lowest class because they didn't really produce anything. They just kind of, helped move it around. So you saw the peasants and artisans actually higher than the merchant class. And as I said, the daimyo, this is kind of unique to Japan. So anyway, they were similar to European lords and vassals and so on, but still different. It was still a somewhat different relationship. The key point of state formation happened in the second half of the 1500s, where basically neither the emperor nor a shogun could, build a strong enough alliance, so they kind of got together and developed the Tokugawa shogunate, and this lasts for a couple of centuries and essentially is the last shogunate, and changes after a meeting some Europeans and Americans and looking at their technology. So Japan's feudalism in some ways was closer to what we saw in Eastern Europe rather than in Western Europe, in the sense that the shogun it wasn't necessarily hereditary, but rather they were kind of chosen by the various daimyo and samurai. And the daimyo ultimately controlled all the towns and the trade. Then in 1868, Japan realizes that that its feudal system is not there's sort of become sort of archaic, that it won't help it modernize. It had watched what had happened to China with the Opium Wars and so on, where Britain essentially basically kind of colonized China, or at least exploited China quite dramatically. So you get the Meiji Restoration, where a lot of Japanese start to adopt Western practices, and perhaps most importantly, a lot of Western military practices. So you get the ancient samurai. There's still a few of them that are around, but they're pretty quickly disbanded then. And pretty soon you see the old shogun, the old samurai class, and as well as some of the peasants, become military, and you see that they start wearing more European-looking military uniforms and things like that, and they still hold a lot of their Japanese values, though, and that's kind of what's really fascinating. I think one of the fascinating things about Japan is this tension. So that's kind of brought out in the work of the writer Yukio Mishima. Mishima wrote a book called Yukio Mishima on Hagakure, the samurai ethic in modern Japan. Hagakure is this book that was written by a samurai in the 1600s, I believe, and it's where the phrase the way of the samurai is the way of death. That comes from him, even though he died at a ripe old age of 65 or something like this. That initial writer of the Hagakure. Mishima was a writer in Japan, and he did not serve in the Second World War, and I think he always regretted that. And he kind of extolled a lot of those old values of Japan. He was watching Japan modernize after the Second World War and become a powerful consumer society. And so he is kind of wanting Japan to return to its old values. He gets a number he actually develops this private militia. He and a few of his followers then they go to this military compound and they sort of kidnap and hold this general hostage. And Mishima goes and he gives a speech to the soldiers that are standing below, and he's telling them that they need to go back to their traditional ways of defending the empire and the emperor, I should say. And they're all just kind of like laughing and jeering at him and not taking him seriously. And he goes back inside and commits seppuku, which is this ancient form of suicide where you stab yourself and cut yourself open. And he does that, and it's this big kind of artistic performance, but it's basically in response to what he sees as this change of Japanese culture from the one that he honored, this sort of samurai past, and he kind of wants to go back to that feudal time, and this new, very modern consumer society, which he's very much a part of, and that's kind of the thing that's most fascinating about him. Anyway, that will be the end of the lecture, and as I said, I will on Thursday upload the next lecture, which will cover Chapter 3, Nations and Citizens. All right, have a good week, everyone.